On our quest to grow spiritually, I'm reminded, or have been reminded this week, that the distance that needs to be traveled, if we're really going to be like Christ, it's a long ways. It's a long distance. It's not a long distance to salvation, because salvation is right there. And we just have to make a simple choice to choose to follow Christ. But living that out and becoming like Him, so that we're not just faking it. Because I'm afraid, and I know in my life, when I was younger and in many Christians' lives, we try to, I don't know that we're trying to do it on purpose, but we fake being a Christian. Like we know how you're supposed to act, and maybe some of us grew up in a home where our parents taught us, well, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, so you act like this. But our heart was far from that. And I've been reminded this week of a book written by Dr. Michael Haynes, who's the Director of Missions in Greene County Baptist Association. It's called The Key is to Be. I mentioned this book several years ago. But it's a great book because it highlights or underlines the importance of just being a Christian. You don't have to try to be a great leader in the church. You don't have to try to be a great pastor. You don't have to try to be all these things for everybody else. But just to be a follower of Christ, very simply. And that's really the goal. And what we've been talking about these past 7 or 8 or 9 weeks, however long it's been, we've been talking about spiritual maturity. I hope you're not bored of it. I hope that you're getting more energized. And maybe even by now you're getting to the point where you're thinking, okay, I'm ready to take this seriously. I'm ready to really be the real deal. Not just fake it, not just act like it, not just post like it on Facebook. Because you see, oh, well, this is what everybody else is posting, so I'm just going to go post that because that looks like that's what I should post. And I want us to read together Matthew chapter 18. That's where we're going to start today. We're actually going to look at a story in the Old Testament about King Nebuchadnezzar. But we're going to start out looking at Jesus, because if the goal is to follow Jesus, and if that's what it literally means to be a Christian literally means little Christ. And so if that's our ultimate goal, then obviously Jesus is who we look at to understand and to know what it means to follow Him. And there's a great message right here in Matthew, because one of the biggest obstacles to becoming spiritually mature is pride. Pride ultimately is the worship of ourself. And so when we put ourselves out there in the way, it's like an eclipse, and we block our ability to see the light of Christ. And that's something that we choose to do. It doesn't just happen to us, but we make that choice, that pride is actually a verb, and it's something that we choose to do, and we have to remove it or diminish it in order to be more like Christ. So let's read this together. Matthew chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. We're going to read the first 9 verses. At that time the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Okay, obviously a very prideful question, right? Who's the greatest? Which among us is going to be the best? And He called a child to Him, and He had him stand among them. I assure you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so Jesus completely reframes the statement. Okay, he didn't even answer the question directly, but he basically says you're not even going to be in the kingdom of heaven unless you become like this child, unless you humble yourself and diminish yourself to be like this child. And he goes on to say, he says, "Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child, this one is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one child like this in my name welcomes me." And we see that in several places, don't we? Where Jesus picks the humbleness. He picks the least of these, and He says, if you love them, if you serve them, if you're like them, then you're doing that to me. But then He says, in contrast, in verse 6, "Whoever causes the downfall of one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for him if a heavy millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea." A little violent. "Woe to the world because of offenses. For offenses must come, but woe to the man by whom they come. If your hand or your foot causes your downfall, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire." It's talking about hell. And if your eye causes you your downfall, gouge it out and throw it away. For it is better for you to enter life with one eye, rather than to have two eyes and to be thrown into hellfire. So really, is your spiritual growth that important to you, that you would remove a limb as a priority over just doing the status quo? Or even worse, just openly living in rebellion and sin against God? Pride is something I think I could probably safely say that everyone struggles with. I know that many times we talk about sin, we talk about evil, and that there are certain sins, there are certain things that each of us struggle with, and it's different for each of us. But I would say, I would argue, I would contend, and I can't prove it, and this is a very subjective statement, but I would contend that all of us at some level struggle with pride. We struggle with putting our needs before others. We struggle with making ourselves comfortable at the expense of someone else. You might think, oh, well, I'm not doing that. I'm not making myself comfortable at someone else's expense. Well, I think we all ate today, unless you just got here and you skipped lunch. And so we ate at the expense of someone else. Well, we could have fed someone else who didn't eat. So really, at some level, we're selfish, even in the most simple things. I mean, how many of us even thought about, I have to be honest, I don't know that I thought about feeding anyone else today. Think about it. We just did our normal thing where we bring our food, or in this case today, we ordered pizza and brought it because my wife is sick and wasn't able to cook anything. And boom, here it was. I was just doing my duty. My heart probably wasn't really even in it. And so pride then gets in our way. It keeps us from seeing Christ, and it keeps us from emulating Him, from being like Him. Let's look at Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Where in this epistle it says, "Do not out of rivalry or conceit," okay, that means kind of out of, trying to pick a fight or thinking that we're better, "but rather in humility consider others more important than yourselves. Everyone should look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. Make your attitude that of Christ Jesus." And then it goes on, we're not going to read it, but lists some examples and talks very specifically about that. So that's the problem. The problem is us, our selfishness, our evil desires, that they get in our way. And until we're willing to pay what it costs to make it right, to fix it, we're not going to be able to get there. It's just not going to happen. We've recently sold a property that we had in Springfield for many, many, many years. We actually lived there when we first got married, and it needed a lot of work before we went to sell it. And then it seemed like every time I was over there working on it, which it was hard to get over there because it's 45 minutes away, it's on the total opposite side of Springfield, there would be some new problem that it had. The furnace wasn't working, or there was some kind of water issue or an electrical issue, or it just kept on coming up with issues. And my first instinct whenever I approach just about any job is, how quickly and how inexpensively can I get this done? All right, that's just my goal. I'm not really thinking about diving into some huge project that I know I don't have time for, and thinking about spending all the money necessary and getting all the tools necessary. I had a bunch of molding I had to do, and so I showed up with my little miter box because I didn't want to haul my big miter saw up there, and probably at the end of the day it would have been faster if I would have just hauled the big saw up there, and then I could have just and set them out there on the back of the deck, because I didn't want to load the truck. So I kept trying to take shortcuts in order to get it done. And I wasn't really focused on fixing it and making it right at first. Now eventually that's what I did. I finally broke down. I was just accepted it. Okay, it's going to cost a lot of money, many thousands of dollars. It's going to take a lot of extra time that I didn't have. So that means I'm going to have to pay other people to come and work. And we had, I don't know how many trades out there doing work at different times. But that was what it was going to take to make it right, to make it habitable, to make it a good property where somebody's going to want to live. And that's as I've been thinking about that whole process that fortunately is behind me now, that's a lot like our quest to become like Christ, to become spiritually mature. It's going to cost us a lot more than we think that it's going to. it's going to take a lot more time than we think that it's going to. And so we have to decide ultimately, is it important enough for us to make the hard choices, to make the difficult decisions that need to be made in our lives? Luke 14:11 says, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted." I think we all want to be exalted. I think at some level that's not necessarily a bad thing. We want to thrive. We want to enjoy life. We want to live in peace with our neighbors. We want to just to live, to exist, to enjoy life. And life, it happens so fast. I'm just now beginning to see how quickly life is. I mean, ask somebody who's 70, 80 plus years old, and they can explain even more clearly, how quickly life is here and gone. So we don't have, I would suggest we don't have as much time as we think we do to get spiritually mature. Because I always thought, well, someday I'll become spiritually mature. Someday when it's convenient, when I have time, when I can just sit and meditate all day and stick my Bible out in front of me like this and sniff the words and do some kind of strange spiritual thing, that I will be spiritually mature then. But God wants us to begin right now. In fact, He is in the midst of the chaos of life with us, working that out, shaping us and molding us to be like Him. So let's turn now, let's look at Daniel chapter 4 in the Old Testament. Daniel was a prophet. He was the guy who, was thrown in the lion's den, lived during a very difficult time when Babylon had conquered Israel, and its greatness was but a distant memory, and there were just a few faithful people that were still loyal to the one true God, and that was Daniel. And so there were a lot of great stories. And this particular story we're going to look at today, it's one that I think, or maybe it's for you, it will not be, but for me, it's kind of hard to understand. I think it's hard to really see what's happening in the story and the significance of it, because it's so shrouded in that culture and in that time, which is so different. The ancient Babylon was just a different way of life than it is now. It was in the East. The Babylonians were a very arrogant and aggressive people. They worshipped all kinds of pagan gods and goddesses, and they had very little respect or consideration for the nations and the peoples that they conquered. But here, even in the midst of all that, we have a story of how God reveals Himself. And through this, Daniel has to really stand firm to the truth, and God uses him to make an impact in King Nebuchadnezzar's life. So let's read through this together, beginning in verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, to those of every people, nation, and language who live in all the earth, may your prosperity increase. And I am pleased to tell you about the miracles and wonders of the Most High God has done for me. How great are His miracles and how mighty His wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom, and His dominion is from generation to generation. So we have this very unlikely scenario where this Babylonian king is exalting God and praising God. It has been argued since the earliest of church arguments, I'm sure, as to whether or not Nebuchadnezzar actually, became, I guess he wouldn't become a Christian because Christ hadn't come yet, but become a worshiper of God. That's hotly debated. But at the very least, I think we can say that he had a respect and a fear and a recognition of who God was. And so he writes, and probably more accurately, one of his scribes writes for him. Of course, we believe as an inspired writing of this experience that he has as Daniel interprets this dream that he has, and as he goes through this 7-year experience in his life. So let's read it together. So we kind of start out with the conclusion, and now we go to the story. How did Nebuchadnezzar come to understand what's happened? I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. All right, isn't that how trouble finds us in life? Everything's going good. We're relaxed, we're comfortable, and we want to stay that way. It's like getting out of bed on a really cold morning. You just don't want to do it. You just want to stay where it's warm and nice, and you don't want to go outside. I had a dream, and it frightened me. While in my bed, the images and visions in my mind alarmed me. And so I issued a decree to bring all the wise men of Babylon to me in order that they might make the dream's interpretation known to me. Now, what does that story remind you of? Anybody? Joseph. Yeah, that's right. When the diviner, priests, mediums, Chaldeans, and astrologers came in, I told them the dream. Okay, so these are all the frauds. These are the psychics, the fortune tellers, the witch doctors, the people that, conjure up some way of being wise or of knowing things or of knowing the future, or who look at the stars to try to come up with some kind of answers to things. And he tells them the dream. And it goes on, we're in verse 7, if I lost you. But they could not make its interpretation known to me. Finally, Daniel came. Daniel named Belteshazzar. Sorry, my little microphone cover is missing, so that's why it's thudding. I'm going to try to lower it a little bit. Let's see maybe if that's not quite as bad. Belteshazzar, all right, and that's Daniel, okay, but that's his Babylonian name. Daniel's his Hebrew name. After the name of my God and the spirit of the holy gods is in him, came before me. And I told him the dream. And just as kind of a side note, I know some of you guys are into the scholarly aspects of this and other of you guys could care less. And I get both sides of that. But if you're wondering, the scholarly side of me says, what in the world, the spirit of the holy gods, plural, in him? You have to remember that this is King Nebuchadnezzar's understanding, okay, of what's happening and of who Daniel is. Belteshazzar, head of the diviners, because I know that you have a spirit of the holy gods and that no mystery puzzles you, explain to me the visions of my dream that I saw and its interpretation. In the visions of my mind, as I was lying in bed, I saw this, okay, and here's his vision, here's his dream that he had. There was a tree in the middle of the earth. Not a tree in Middle Earth, don't go Lord of the Rings on me, but a tree in the middle of the earth. Okay, although it does, sound cool. And its height was great. So the tree grew large and strong, and its top reached to the sky. And it was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit was abundant, and on it was food for all. Wild animals found shelter under it, the birds of the air lived in its branches, and every creature was fed from it. And as I was lying in my bed, I saw in the visions of my mind an observer, a holy one, coming down from heaven, and he called out loudly, "Cut down the tree and chop off its branches, and strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump with its roots in the ground, and with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the tender grass of the field. Let him be drenched with dew from the sky, and share the plants of the earth with the animals. And let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal for 7 periods of time." Now this is going to be 7 years. Okay, so 7, that's what the periods of time are, 7 years. "This word is by decree of the observers. The matter is a command from the holy ones. This is so the living will know that the Most High is ruler over the kingdom of men. And he gives it to anyone who wants and sets the lowliest of men over it." Oh, it sounds so Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to go there. "This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me your interpretation, because none of the wise men of my kingdom can make the interpretation known to me. But you can, because you have the spirit of the holy gods." Okay, so in other words, he's seen Daniel in the past. He's seen the power that Daniel has because he worships the one true God. And because of the person that Daniel is, his witness, his testimony has obviously had a profound impact on the king. And now the king has come to him to interpret this dream. Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was stunned for a moment, and his thoughts alarmed him. And the king said, "Belteshazzar, don't let the dream or its interpretation alarm you." And so he answered, "My lord, may the dream apply to those who hate you, and its interpretation to your enemies. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, whose top reached to the sky and was visible to all the earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals lived, in its branches the birds of the air lived. That tree is you, the king. For you have become great and strong, and your greatness has grown and even reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to the ends of the earth. The king saw an observer, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, Cut down this tree and destroy it. But leave the stump with its roots in the ground, and with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the tender grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew from the sky, and share food with the wild animals for 7 periods of time. This is the interpretation. Your Majesty, and this is the sentence of the Most High that has been passed against my Lord the King. In other words, this is what God's punishment is going to be to you. Because of your pride, because of your arrogance, this is what's going to happen. You will be driven away from people to live with the wild animals. You will feed on grass like cattle and be drenched with dew from the sky for 7 periods of time until you acknowledge that the Most High is ruler over the kingdom of men and gives it to anyone He wants. As for the command to leave the tree stump with its roots, your kingdom will be restored to you as soon as you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, may my advice seem good to you, my king. Separate yourself from your sins by doing what is right, and from your injustices by showing mercy to the needy. And perhaps there will be an extension to your prosperity. Okay, so obviously the king was very great. He was very powerful. And God was going to judge him because of his pride, because he did not worship the one true God, because he sought earthly wealth, earthly kingdom, or earthly fame and kingship, and so he was going to be humbled. And I hope that brings to my mind that New Testament verse that whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Because we tend to have it backwards in life. We search for these things, whether they're outward or inward. They become a stumbling block for us. They become something that gets in our path that trips us up. In the little farmhouse that we moved into, it was built in the 1960s, and if you ever lived in an older home, they didn't have lights everywhere like houses do now. When you build a new house now, there's like 10 lights in every room, and there's candle lights in the hallways, and there's just lights everywhere. But in those houses, a lot of times you would plug a lamp in, and there would be a switch for the lamp. You guys, a lot of you guys, I can tell you've lived in houses like that. And that's how our house is. So when it gets darker outside, it gets darker inside because I guess we could install some new light fixtures and do some things, but we haven't done that. And so it just gets dark. It gets dim. And many times, and plus we're kind of crammed in there, we have stuff everywhere, but many times I am just tripping through the house to get to the bathroom or to the kitchen or from outside or whatever, and so I constantly just trip over little things that stick out in the way because I can't see as well as I'm used to seeing. I'm used to just kind of cruising through it, don't really think about it. Had several wipeouts, watched the kids have several wipeouts. And it's kind of funny, but it happens, and so we're getting used to that. But life is very much like that. That these things that we've allowed to be in our path, they trip us up, we fall down, or they cause us problems. There is this mentality that is unique, I think, to probably the last 20 or 30 years in America, and it is this. I don't know what else to call it other than it's this victim mentality. In other words, everything that's wrong with my life, it's someone else's fault. Every problem that I have, whether I don't have enough money, or I don't have a good job, or I don't have a good education, or I don't have the right fishing boat that I want, or the right house that I want, or the right car, or whatever it is, it's someone else's fault. Woe is me. It's the government's fault, it's the economy's fault, it's my parents' fault, it's my children. It's always someone else's fault. But we have a hard time culturally taking responsibility for ourselves, for our actions. If I trip over something in my house, that's my fault. Okay? It's not the thing's fault. It's my fault because I let it be there, or I put it there, or I wasn't being careful, or I wasn't lighting up the path. And there are so many things in life where, and I get it, that's a sin nature, that's our pride. We don't want to admit that we're wrong. I mean, what are half of our disagreements about in marriage a lot of times? We don't want to admit that we did something wrong, right? So we're going through this whole thing of how it was something else's fault or somebody else's fault, and we're the victim. You know, it's never we're never taking responsibility. It's never our fault. But God has called us to live a different kind of life. A life of humility is one where we take responsibility for our actions, for our choices. And sure, bad things happen to us that aren't our fault. I'm not saying that every bad thing that ever happened to you is your fault. But many times the problems and the difficulties that we get ourselves into are of our own making. And if it sounds like I say that a lot, it's because I probably do. But it's because it's a truth that is really, it has had a life-changing impact in my life. The day that I realized that I was responsible for my actions. And that if I wanted to have things, if I wanted to be able to accomplish God's work in my life, then I had to earn it. And I had to work hard for it. And it was my responsibility to humble myself and let God do that in my life. That it wasn't necessarily up to me to outperform everyone else or to do whatever, accomplish some great thing, which I haven't really accomplished any great things in my life yet, maybe someday. But that I needed to humble myself and allow God to do that through me. And that's where we seem to get stuck. Because we want our life to be a certain way. I mean, even in the simplest things. You know, I love certain brands of coffee. And there are certain brands of coffee that I don't love as much. And I want to drink that quality coffee that I like to drink. But because of my pride, because of me wanting to have the things that I like. But life is not always about what I like, what is comfortable for me. And sometimes it's better for me to not drink any coffee. And that's a simple illustration compared to the epic story that we're examining with Daniel. But the principle is still the same. We have to choose to give up our will. We have to choose to humble ourselves so that God can accomplish things in our life. And so as we go on and we can continue to read in chapter 4, all these things come to pass. And King Nebuchadnezzar basically becomes like this crazy man for 7 years, and he goes around eating grass and, you know, just like a cow and just crazy stuff. And God humbles him and brings him low. But if you remember in the prophecy that we read, he said to leave the stump, all right, to leave the foundation. In other words, he left that possibility for him to be restored. And then we see him, if we skip down to verse 34, it says, "But at the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity returned to me. And then I praised the Most High, and I honored and glorified Him who lives forever. For His dominion is an everlasting dominion, and His kingdom is from generation to generation." So King Nebuchadnezzar leaves for us a legacy of who God is. And it is clear by some of the things that he says that he doesn't fully understand who God is, even at the end. But because of Daniel, because of the witness that he was able to make a huge impact. And one of the greatest and most powerful kings of kingdoms that have existed and civilizations that have existed on the earth. But don't be fooled. No matter how exalted we may find ourselves in life, that one day we will all bow down before God. And we will all give an account of the life that we've lived. And, you know, I think we all are motivated to grow spiritually in different ways. And I think that's fine, you know. But for me, one of the greatest motivations of my life is that understanding and that realization that even though I can come before God and I can pray and I can seek Him and interact with Him in my life, it will be a very unique experience to really stand in the presence of God. And to know every terrible thing that I've ever done, to know every time that God has told me to do something and I didn't do it, every time I've done something that God told me not to do and I went ahead and did it anyway, to know that in that moment it will all kind of simultaneously come to bear. And that's a motivating factor for me. And it's also a motivating factor for me to realize that I have an impact on everyone else around me, for good and for bad. I've seen good leadership be a blessing in my family, and I've seen poor leadership be a curse in my family. And so for many reasons, for me personally, growing spiritually is something that is very important to me. And so I want to ask you, as we kind of get towards the end here today, I want to ask you, what would it take for you to get motivated, to really seek after Christ, to really grow spiritually? And I know for many of you are. Many of you you're seeking God, you're changing. I can see that fruit in your life. I can see that God is at work and that you are growing and that you are changing. But for those of you that are kind of stuck, and you just, your spiritual growth, your quiet time, you just feel kind of, I don't know, just in no man's land. And I understand that. I've had those times in my life where I just felt like God wasn't hearing my prayers. I felt like I wasn't really in His will. I felt like I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing in my life, and I felt like there was something that was in the way between me and God. And in some form, whether it's sin, whether it's apathy, it's our pride that's that thing that's causing that eclipse where our relationship with God is broken. And when our relationship with God is broken, really everything in our life is broken. It's like trying to get your car to move and everything's working in it except the fuel line. There's no fuel getting into your car, and so it doesn't matter how great the electronics are, and it doesn't matter how great the tires are, it's not going anywhere. And that's how our life is. And some of us are broken down, we're on the side of the road, and we need to get back on track. And so that's my challenge for you today, and we're going to take some time and just pray about that. Matthew 20, verse 20, it says, "Then the mother of Zebedee's sons approached him with her sons. She knelt down to ask him for something. 'What do you want?' he asked her. 'Promise,' she said to him, 'that these two sons of mine may sit, one at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom.' But Jesus answered, 'You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink?' 'We are able,' they said to him. But he told them, 'You will indeed drink my cup, but to sit at my right and left is not mine to give. Instead, it belongs to those for whom it has been prepared by my Father.' And when the disciples heard this, they became indignant with these brothers. And Jesus called them over and said, 'You know that the rulers of the Gentiles dominate them, and the men of high positions exercise power over them. It must not be like that among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life a ransom for many." Let's pray. God, I pray that your words would just wash over us right now. And if our pride's in the way, God, I pray that it would be like the waves of this hurricane that just hit Mexico, that it would just knock it down, just move right through it. And that we would be confronted with the truth in our lives. Not the truth we imagine, but what really is. And God, I just pray that today that you would just work in each heart, that you would bring a spirit of humility, that we would recognize those things that keep us from being right with you, that keep us from moving forward in our walk with you. For some, it's addiction to sin. For some, it's we just don't care anymore. For some, it's laziness. For some, it's ignorance. We've never been confronted really with the truth. So God, I just pray that wherever we are, whatever our struggle is, whatever that obstacle is, I pray, Lord, that you would overcome that in our lives through your great power. The same power and might that changed King Nebuchadnezzar. The same power that overcame death on the cross. The same power that spoke the truth to the nations. And I pray, Lord, that today that same truth would speak to the deepest part of our hearts. That we would seek you and find you. that we would come with humble and repentant hearts. And if we've wronged someone, we need to go make that right. I pray that you would give us the courage to do it. If we're living in a sin or battling with a sin that we know we need to throw away, I pray that you would give us the courage to do that. If you've called us to a great task and we've just walked away from it because we were afraid, I pray, Lord, that we would come back and that we would repent and we would turn to you. Will in our church, in our lives, in Jesus' name.